infamous Dustin Harris hanging out with you. Folks, I've got a great show coming up for you. Great guest. I'll just let the cat out of the bag right now because I know it'll keep you tuned in. Tim Andersen is with us again. And but before I bring him on for some questions, some details, some information, I want to remind you, of course, we are sponsored by three great companies, one of them being OREP Insurance. Folks, I've been with OREP for about 3.5 years now. Great company to work with. Every time I call, they actually answer the phone. You know, what company does that, right? People that will talk to you as if you are a person. So check them out. Go to orep.org. That's orep, OREP.org for more information. Datamaster is a sponsor here. Datamaster is the company which allows you to download information directly into your report, saving you 30 to 60 minutes per report. Go to datamasterfreetrial.com/coach for your 14-day free trial. Once again, it's datamasterfreetrial.com/coach. And finally, we are sponsored by Alamode. Alamode software is the software that I've been using for over 2 decades. You should be as well. Go to alamode.com or 800-ALAMODE for more information. Well, folks, I already let the cat out of the bag, and I did that to keep you tuned in. I know when Tim Andersen is on, these are highly watched and highly listened to shows. Tim, welcome back to the program, my friend.
Dustin, thank you. I appreciate it. It's always good to be with you. And as always, my best to your family.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And to yours as well. So Tim is on because, I might as well face it, Tim. I've been doing this over 2 decades. I think I know what I'm doing. And then every once in a while, I run into these situations that humble me and help me realize that I honestly don't have a clue. I mean, I'm getting by day to day. I'm trying to be the best appraiser that I can, but even the fundamentals sometimes baffle me. And so that's really where we are today. Those who have clicked on this website or podcast, as the case may be, already know the title of this is going to be Highest and Best Use Revisited. The reason for that, Tim, is you and I did a podcast a while back, actually. It's been quite a while on highest and best use. We kind of covered some of the basics of highest and best use. I think that was back in April of 2017. If anybody wants to go back and listen to that, I would highly encourage that they do so. It is episode number 215. So if you go to the website and just type in highest and best use or type in the number 215, you'll be able to pull that up just fine and be able to listen to what Tim and I talked about before. But Tim, highest and best use is something that seems pretty straightforward. It seems pretty easy, if you will. But I think maybe that's where we get ourselves in trouble, is that we sometimes don't take it seriously enough.
Dustin, yeah, it's interesting for something that is at the essential heart of an appraisal. We spend almost no time educating appraisers to it. And let me get in a plug here right now to our fellow appraisers. I would highly recommend that anybody, and I don't care how long you've been in the business, sign up for a residential highest and best use class, be it through the Institute or the ASA or NIFA or whoever. Take the class and come to understand what highest and best use is. And I think you and I already know and both agree that highest and best use is not merely checking that single box on the first page of the UAR form.
Yeah.
It's a significant analytical protocol that is the center of appraising, because by definition, property B is not a comparable to property A unless and until property B has the same highest and best use as the subject.
Okay. And
the only way to determine that is to go through the analytics. And there are 2 sets of analytics that you have to go through. Now, Dustin, let me ask a question, and I'm going to use the word you, and I don't mean you, Dustin. I mean you rhetorically. Do you know the 2 sets of protocols that an appraiser has to go through to arrive at a highest and best use conclusion?
Okay, so I want to, before I answer that question, I want to set this up properly and say, Tim, you and I have spoken on the phone a couple of times and over email just in the last 24 hours. And really the reason for this episode is the situation that I found myself in recently. And I called Tim because Tim's an expert. Tim's a friend of mine. Tim, I trust with, I don't know if I trust you with my life, Tim, but darn close. And so I called Tim and I've been educated in the last 24 hours. And so what I want to do is step back away from that a little bit and pretend that those last 24 hours didn't happen. We're going to go back in time, if you will. And I want to play devil's advocate a little bit here. In other words, I know the answer to your question now, I don't know that I knew it 24 hours ago. So I'm going to play Dustin 24 hours. I was a little thinner back then, 24 hours ago. And so we're going to go back to 24 hours ago. And I'm going to say, no, Tim, I have no idea what you're talking about. What do you mean two approaches?
Okay. Let's go to USPAP. And I know everybody hates going to USPAP, but let's go to USPAP. And if you look at Standard Rule 1-3, it says that you have to, number one, analyze, not list, not look at, not read. It says that we appraisers have to analyze the physical, economic, and legal characteristics of the subject property in order to form the highest and best use on that property.
Yes.
Now, that is the first step in the protocol.
Okay.
Now, where on the 1004 form do appraisers have the opportunity to analyze the economic characteristics of the subject property? And that begs the question, what are the economic characteristics of a piece of real property?
Okay, so we're getting in the weeds already, but I think it's impossible to avoid. In other words, I think one of the reasons you pointed out, one of the reasons we appraisers don't like to delve into this too deep is because it is deep. It's challenging, it's difficult, and I think it's important that we do dig into it a little bit. So talk to us. Where do we start? Because I think a lot of appraisers are just checking a box.
That's right. And the reason that it's so difficult to analyze for example, the economic factors of a particular piece of property is simply because there's no place on the form to do it. Now, that in and of itself is no excuse.
Right.
The appraiser has to conform the report to USPAP. The report does not have to conform to USPAP.
Okay.
So that means that somewhere in the report, usually in an addendum, the appraiser has to analyze the economic characteristics of the property. Now, for your basic single-family home that keeps the snow off your head and gives you a place to celebrate the holidays and birthdays and stuff like that, what are the economic characteristics of it? And you say, Tim, Dustin, a house doesn't have any economic characteristics. Well, assuming that it's not held for rental purposes, that's sort of true.
Okay.
Now, one of the things we don't look at is, okay, it may not be held for rental purposes, but if it were to be held for rental purposes, how much would it rent for?
Right.
And typically, we don't get into that. So there is one area in which many appraisals are deficient. We don't look at not only what it would rent for, but what are the chances of it actually renting at that particular price. Now, you like to go to Jackson Hole, okay? If you have a house near the ski slopes in Jackson Hole and it's furnished, you can probably rent it for $500 to $7,500 a month during the winter season, and that generates a lot of income.
Sure.
And you could let it sit vacant the rest of the year, and that would probably pay for the house. But typically, we don't look at single-family homes as income generating. So we have to pretend. Number one, how much would it generate? And number two, what is the probability that at that rental rate, it would rent up, let's say, 90% of the time? So that's part of your highest and best use. Just say, look, one of the reasons I didn't do the income approach is because via a quick and dirty analysis, I determined that while the property may rent for about $1,200 a month, there's no rental demand in the subject's neighborhood. Right. So maybe there's a 20% probability that it would rent.
Yep.
Well, it doesn't make any sense to buy a house for rental purposes if you've got an 80% vacancy factor.
Yep.
Well, that's part of your highest and best use.
Okay.
Then, Dustin, what are interest rates? Now, right now, you can go to a bank and the typically qualified borrower can get an interest rate probably under 4%. And, minimal points, typical closing costs, et cetera. So, in other words, real estate is highly affordable right now for most folks, as long as they're willing to take on the kind of debt that they have to take on to buy a house in the United States. Now, what would happen? How marketable would houses be? How many people would be in the market to buy a house if tomorrow interest rates were 20%?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So the point is, interest rates, for example, are an economic characteristic of the subject property.
Okay.
Now, let's suppose that the Walmart, which is located 2 miles away from the subject, for whatever reason, decides to close. All right. Is that going to affect the value of the subject? In a really big city, in a really big county, maybe not. But in a more rural area, that type of hit to the local economy could affect the marketability and therefore the price of houses. Prices would most likely fall.
Yeah.
That is another economic characteristic that appraisers tend either to ignore or merely pass over. Now, what are the physical characteristics of the subject? Well, okay, how big is it? What's it made of? How old is it? What conditions it's in? Stuff like that. We all understand that. But yet, I can't tell you how many residential appraisals I've reviewed over the years. And maybe a half a dozen of them have shown a functional obsolescence factor. But let's face it, a 25-year-old house has functional obsolescence.
Okay. Right.
Okay. People are willing to pay more for new houses than they're willing to pay for used houses, typically, because new houses are new. And, let's face it, my wife and I just sold our last rental property. And of course, me being the superb real estate analyst I am, we figured out that we could spend between $12,000 and $15,000 fixing it up before we sell it. So of course we spent about $25,000
Sure. Oh, yeah.
fixing it up before we sold it. But the point was, there was nothing wrong with its physical condition, but it needed an entirely new air conditioning system, and the carpet had to be replaced. And let's face it, that particular unit was in a project that was the better part of 40 years old. And while the market is buying units in there, there's market demand for it. Newer units in other parts of northern Palm Beach County, where I live, that are similar in design but are newer, are selling for more. So as a result, there is a functional obsolescence factor in that the closets in those particular units were not particularly large. In the newer units, they are. So there is an issue, there is a physical issue with the size of the closets. But yet, you'll never see that taken into account in the cost approach, simply because the appraiser says, well, in the sales comparison approach, they're all in the same project, so they all have the same physical attributes. They do. That's true. But not in the cost approach.
Interesting.
And so that is part of the physical characteristics of the subject. The legal characteristics of the subject include items such as, okay, how many of the bundle of sticks do you get? Do you get all of them? Or did somebody reserve the mineral rights 150 years ago when the land was first platted? Relatively common. How about water rights? How about riparian rights? Do you get all those? Okay, what's the zoning? Now, appraisers tend to say, oh, the zoning is residential. What kind of difference does the zoning make? You can build houses there. Yeah, it's residential. You can build houses there. But does the zoning limit size? Does the zoning require a minimum size? Does the zoning allow mother-in-law apartments? Does the zoning allow expansion of your property? Does the zoning make very clear the land to building ratio that cannot be exceeded? Well, those are all legal characteristics of the subject that go into highest and best use. Because let's face it, if you've got a 900 square foot house on a 2-acre lot, chances are the site is underused, even though somebody might be willing to buy that 900 square foot house on that 2-acre site. If that site were vacant, you wouldn't build a 900 square foot house on it. You might build a 3,500 square foot house on it because a 2-acre site will take it. So when we're looking at highest and best use, we have to look at number one, the economic characteristics, number two, the legal characteristics, and number three, the physical characteristics, although not necessarily in that order, in order to come up with the highest and best use, which is standard rule 1-3B. It says the appraiser will develop a highest and best use of the real estate, which typically means as improved. And yes, typically the highest and best use is what's there, but not necessarily, especially in older or hot markets.
Now, this goes back to your original answer where you had talked about there's really kind of two approaches, right?
Right. Well, not two approaches, but two highest and best use analyses.
Okay.
One of the site as if it were vacant, and number two, the present improvements.
Okay.
Now, I know where over in the town of Palm Beach, which is a completely separate market unto itself, it is very common for 20-year-old houses to be torn down so that the buyer can get at the underlying site and redevelop it. Very common because there is no more land in the town of Palm Beach. It's not there.
Right.
It has been 100% built out for the last 75 years.
Okay.
So again, houses in Palm Beach age very quickly. Not that there's anything wrong with their design or construction, but somebody is quite willing to buy a 20-year-old house, raise it, and then put a brand new house on the site. So a part of appraising, and this is probably true in Jackson Hole, simply because it is a resort and there is a lot of money there, and there is a lot of custom construction there. So as a result, if the site were vacant, what would that site be worth? Now, most appraisers say, well, it's built, so I don't really worry about it. Okay. However, there's the cost approach. And the very top line of the cost approach says, what's the site worth as if it were vacant? Well, again, let's get back to definition. The appraiser must know what the highest and best use of the site is in order to choose comps. And if you don't, then Dustin, you're just kind of hanging yourself out in the wind, hoping that the state or a client or a borrower does not take umbrage at your appraisal.
Right.
Now, you know as well as I do that if you look at the cost approach section of the 1004 form, the very top lines, it says, whatever the appraiser does in the cost approach, the client has got to be able to replicate it. Okay. And I'm going to use the word you, and I don't mean you, Dustin. I mean it rhetorically. How many of you have enough data in the cost approach that the client could replicate it? I would imagine, Dustin, that 99% of the time, nobody does. And I've seen too many appraisals where it says, okay, where did you come up with these data? Oh, builders. Well, that's great. Good. But from what you put in the report, quote, builders, unquote, can you replicate the cost approach?
Right.
And then if all you put in that blank line, the site's worth $125,000, well, can the client from that alone, because that's all you put, can the client replicate from that the processes you went through to come up with the value of the site as a vacant? If the client cannot, then all you need to do is turn to Standard Rule 2-3, and I think it's the 7th bullet point. And it says, I did my appraisal in compliance with USPAP. Well, no, you didn't. And if you sign the certification, you just lied.
Gee, this is really positive and uplifting, Tim. When we get back from the break, what I want to do is set this up in such a way that to retell the story that I told Tim last night and have him walk us through some of the things that I learned over the last 24 hours. But speaking of learning things, how would you like to learn to be more efficient, more effective at what you do? How about a la mode teach you that process? No, I'm not talking about a class. No, I'm not talking about a workshop. I'm not even talking about a podcast. I'm talking about getting in and doing an appraisal on a software that will allow you to learn how to be more efficient, more effective, because the tools are so easy to learn, so easy to utilize, that you have no choice but to learn how to be more efficient and more effective. Folks, I use that term a lot, effectiveness and efficiencies. What does that mean? That means money in your pocket, folks. When you can do more with less, that means you're making more money as a self-employed individual. If you are not on a la mode, you need to check them out. Go to alamode.com. You can call them. A la mode is easily reachable. It's an 800 number. In fact, it's 800 a la mode. That's how easy it is. Pick up the phone, talk to the people, the good people there at a la mode. They will answer your questions. They will help you understand. By the way, this will be airing hopefully after Titan Reports has already come out. That's a la mode in the cloud, folks. Check them out. Go to alamode.com or 800 a la mode for more information. We are sponsored, of course, by DataMaster. DataMaster is the opportunity to save 30 to 60 minutes per report. Talk about efficiencies and effectiveness, and talk about higher quality. No more human error as you try to type the comp from one screen to another and possibly mess it up. Anything that's in the MLS or the public records will be imported directly into your report, no matter what software you use. That's what DataMaster will do for you. Check them out. First of all, make sure they're in your area. Go to their map and go to their listings on their website. Go to datamasterfreetrial.com/coach, and you can check out where they are. And then if you are interested, sign up for a 14-day trial. You will get an opportunity to try them out. Unlimited for 14 days. Again, it's datamasterfreetrial.com/coach, datamasterfreetrial.com/coach. Finally, of course, we are sponsored by OREP Insurance. OREP is the E&O that I carry. No, you don't have to have E&O insurance. I do. I choose to. My clients, a lot of them require it. If you're going to have E&O, you might as well have the best. If you don't know what I'm talking about, jump on their website, go to orep.org and just click on the benefits, folks. I dare you to compare the benefits of OREP to whatever E&O insurance provider you have currently. I promise the answer will come that OREP offers more. Find out for yourself. Go to orep.org. Once again, it's orep.org for more information. And we are back. We're talking with Mr. Tim Andersen once again. Tim, welcome back to the program. Thanks for joining me today.
Dustin, thank you. As always, it is a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm going to set up this next section, if you will, with a little bit of a story for the listeners' entertainment, if you will. Tim, you already know this story, but I'll make it short and quick. Basically, I went out and did an appraisal on a property just recently, and really had no indication of what it was until I got out there. I thought it was a single-family home. And sure enough, it was from the outside. Once I got to the inside, by the way, there was no one at home during this time. They had provided me access, and I went ahead and did my thing. Got to the basement and realized, even though I'd seen an exterior door from the outside, got to the basement, realized that there was an interior apartment. Now, when I say interior apartment, it could be accessed from both the Unit 1, if you will, the main house, via the basement, or it could be accessed and there was a door that basically could be closed off and locked, where the access would only be for a tenant situation. I immediately got on the horn and told the office they needed to check out the zoning a little bit more detailed than what they had. They'd already given me the zoning. They'd already looked that up, but the details of whether or not this could be a duplex, legally permissible, if you will, was still up in the air. They did find out that it was legal for them to have a duplex in this area. And now I've got a highest and best use question. I've got a situation where I need to, as an appraiser, decide how to proceed. Now, I'll tell you, Tim, I'm not proud of this, but I'm going to lay myself out there and be very, very vulnerable for my listeners here. I'll tell you, my highest and best use analysis consisted mainly of finding out what single family homes were selling for in that neighborhood versus duplexes like this one we're selling for, multifamily homes. And it was very clear, very quickly, that single family homes were selling for more. Okay, this is the economical side of it. We're selling for more value-wise than multifamily. Therefore, I proceeded as the appraiser to determine that the highest and best use of the property was single family. I went ahead and did the appraisal single family. The client now is coming back and saying, why didn't you do this as a duplex? We ordered it as a single family. We understand that, but we didn't know it was a duplex either until we got your report back. If it's being used as a duplex, it's set up for a duplex, it's legally permissible as a duplex, why didn't you do it as a duplex? My quick answer back to them was the highest and best use indicated that it's a single family. Therefore, I need to proceed as a single family because that is the highest and best use. So I had marked, by the way, no on the report, the 1004 form. It says, is the highest and best use the current use? Well, the current use is multifamily. So I said, no, it's not the current use, but I'm going to do it as the highest and best use, which is the single family side of things. And I got schooled a little bit over the last, in a good way, Tim, over the last 24 hours. And I want to have you help the listeners understand what you taught me about maybe where I might have gone awry.
Well, Dustin, starting off with, let's assume that you were going to do the cost approach. Starting off with that, you would obviously have to look at sales of sites, vacant sites. Mm-hmm. Are they going to be developed with duplexes or are they going to be developed with single family homes? If you determined that assuming the site were vacant, which mm-hmm. clearly it's not,
right?
But had you determined that were the site vacant, that its highest and best use was development with a single family home, then you would have indicated somewhere in the report that were the site vacant, its highest and best use would be development not with a duplex, despite the fact that that's a legal use, but with a single family residence, because according to the fourth criterion of the definition of highest and best use, the highest and best use is that use that brings the highest value to the land, or the most reasonably probable chance of earning a profit. Okay. Now, from a standpoint of highest and best use as improved, the highest and best use as improved might very well be the duplex, even though that isn't the highest and best use as a vacant, because you would have to look at what it would cost to buy the duplex at its reasonable market value, tear it down, and then build a house on that site. In other words, improve the site to its highest and best use. Chances are you'd find that the cost of buying the property, raising the improvements, and building new improvements exceeded what the market would have paid for the duplex. As a result, the highest and best use isn't to tear down the duplex and start all over again. The highest and best use is to continue using it as a duplex until such time as the market says, nah, it's a single family residence, which might be 5 years, it might be 20 years.
Okay. So, and I know my listeners are yelling at their tiny little earbuds right now saying, well, Tim, it's not vacant. It's there. And it, according to Dustin's story, maybe I wouldn't make this very clear, but it could go either way. You don't have to buy the duplex, tear it down, and then rebuild as a single family. I mean, I understand because I've learned so much in the last 24 hours where you're going, but let's clarify that.
Right. And then you would also look at it and say, okay, what would it cost to convert it to a legitimate single family house?
$3.50.
$3.50. Okay. In that particular, let's suppose, Dustin, let's just use $1,000. You told me separately from this conversation that it would take very little time and very little money to convert this property back to a single family residence. Okay, let's just call it $1,000 bucks. All right. The fact that you could convert it for $1,000 to a single family residence means that what you should have done is abandoned the appraisal immediately, bought the duplex, spent the $1,000 to fix it up, and then sold it for that lovely profit that you would have made.
Right.
Okay, but absent that, the highest and best use of the subject is probably its continued present use, unless you determine that spending the $1,000 is going to earn you $15,000. Mm-hmm. In that case, you'd spend the $1,000, convert it to a single family residence, and then either use it as that, or the seller could sell it that way.
Okay. So let me just interject here for a second, just to clarify for the listener's sake, as this story progresses and the things that I'm learning here. So that's essentially what I did. I'll admit freely, this is where I'm very vulnerable. I've admitted it before. I'll admit it again. I took one approach, not two. I didn't look at it as if it were vacant. And so I've learned. I've been schooled. I've been taken to the woodshed by Tim Andersen. That's going to change in the future. That being said, the second approach, I think I did. And where am I missing something in the sense that when you're using $1,000, that's fine. Let's call it $1,000. Really what it is turning the lock around is really what it is. It's got a lock that locks from the inside of the tenant's occupancy so that people who are in Unit 1 can't get into Unit 2 without going outside and going through the proper notification protocol, blah, 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 blah. In other words, nobody's going to walk in on somebody in their bathrobe the way it's currently set up, because it can be locked from the inside of Unit 2. That would basically take switching the locks around or taking them off completely to turn it into a quote unquote single family home. I know some people are saying, well, what about the kitchen? Okay, it's not uncommon in my area to have what we call a canning kitchen in the basement, a second kitchen that is not being used as a duplex. It's just a second kitchen, right? That's not unusual in this neighborhood. So that being said, Tim, what did I do wrong in saying, hey, which one would be more valuable, a single family home or a duplex? And in this case, I determined it was a single family home. The cost to cure for that was minimal, almost non-existent. Therefore, I appraised the property as a single family home. Now I've got a lender coming back and saying, no, we want you to change it. We want you to go duplex because that's what it's set up as.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Who cares what the lender thinks?
So this is another lesson that I learned today. This is good.
The lender's not signing your report, Dustin.
Right. And I want you to make this point, Tim, because I again, I'm going to be very vulnerable on this podcast. There's something that I've been doing for years. It's something I learned from my mentor. And until you and I talked, I did not realize how dangerous it is to do this. And I think this is essential. Sometimes on my report, I will say, per the client, I did such and such. You wagged your finger at me and said, that may not be the best idea. Why?
Okay. Simply, Dustin, because what we as appraisers must avoid is appraising the property to please the client. That's not our job. Okay. Our job is to analyze the market and form an opinion as to the property's market value, either as is or fixed up. In other words, either based on what's there or on an extraordinary assumption or a hypothetical condition. We really don't care what the client thinks about what we do, because we are not here to serve the client. Okay. We are here to tell the client what the client needs to hear, not what the client wants to hear. Now, a friend of mine recently passed away, younger than I am. Well, he went to his doctor, and his doctor told my friend what he had to hear, which was bad news, rather than what he wanted to hear, which was good news, because the doctor had that ethical obligation. We have the ethical obligation to tell our clients what the property is worth. Now, could we say, well, if you converted it from a duplex to a single family residence, it would be worth this much? Sure, under a hypothetical or an extraordinary assumption. Could you say, well, you may want me to appraise it as a duplex, but its highest and best use is converted into a house. And they say, well, we got to have a duplex value. And you say, well, okay, I'll give you both values. But the highest and best use is to convert it to a house. Okay. But I'll give you both values. So you've got it. But when we say, well, according to the client's wishes, basically we're getting very close to crossing the line of advocacy. And appraisers, by definition, are not advocates, because appraisers must be independent, impartial, and objective in formulating and communicating their value opinions. Right. And when you're an advocate, you aren't.
So let me be clear, because I know some people are saying, well, what does this client request have to do with anything regarding highest and best use? Really, essentially, it has everything to do with it, because my initial question when I called you, Tim, yesterday was, can I do a hypothetical highest and best use? In other words, if the client is insistent on me doing this as a duplex, can I do it as a duplex and do it under the hypothetical condition that is the highest and best use, even though I know that it's not? You said yes, if I understood correctly. But my question is, so I could just go in and say, per the client, I did this as a hypothetical, but that's when you stopped me and said, I wouldn't use per the client. What would you put, Tim?
I would put, my analysis indicates that.
Okay. My analysis indicates that the highest and best use is single family. However, I have appraised this under the hypothetical protocol as if it's a single family residence.
Right.
Okay. And just leave out the per the client's instructions.
Right. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just so you don't get into the advocacy end of things.
Okay. So let's wrap things up here and just kind of summarize if we can, because we've been in the weeds a little bit, and I think part of that couldn't be avoided.
And we probably still are, frankly,
Okay.
Which is why I recommended that everybody take a residential highest and best use class.
Good.
Because this is not a subject that lends itself to analysis and explanation in a 30-minute podcast.
I agree. So what I would like to do with that, and I think that's an excellent suggestion, I think that's a good note to end on, but what I want to do is just summarize what I learned over the last, and I'm not going to do it, I'm going to have you do it, Tim, but what I'm saying is I learned something from you that I want you to summarize as we finish up here, that there really are two different, similar and related, but two different approaches to highest and best use. Talk to us about those and what an appraiser should be doing basically every time they do an appraisal.
Every time they do an appraisal. Again, Dustin, technically you have, for the subject, you have two highest and best use analyses. You must go through two highest and best use protocols. One, as if the site were vacant and available to be put to its highest and best use. And number two, as improved. Now, it's the second one that Fannie Mae is really looking for, because quite frankly, you don't have to do the cost approach with very, very rare exceptions. Okay. So they're looking basically, all right, as improved, what's its highest and best use? And Fannie understands, quite frankly, that with older properties, the highest and best use might not be that property, but it's not financially feasible to tear it down and start all over again. So the highest and best use is continued use of the property until the market changes and it makes sense to tear it down and do something else.
Gotcha.
Then you've got the highest and best use analyses for every comp. If you got 8 comps, then you've got at least 8 highest and best use analyses to determine if the highest and best use of those properties you have chosen as comparables have the same highest and best use, or at least one incredibly similar to it. If they don't have the same highest and best use, then they're by definition not comparable. Now, there are the occasional appraisal where there just aren't any comps. Okay, I'll concede that point. And that's a different story. And then you use what you got, but then you got 4 or 5 pages of explanation of why the protocols and the standard analyses don't work, and why you did what you had to do to come up with a value conclusion. But as I say, those are incredibly rare.
Yes. Yeah. And I think most appraisers would recognize when they walk into a situation, because it's pretty obvious. Most situations, and we talked about this on the previous podcast, I think this is important to note to end on. We don't want to overwhelm people, and there's things that we should be thinking about, certainly, as appraisers. Most of the time, highest and best use is pretty straightforward. It's pretty obvious when you're
most of the time, residentially, yes, it is, frankly.
Tim, I can't thank you enough. You're always so kind to make time for us and be on, and I get such great feedback from my listeners whenever you're on. Your knowledge and your willingness to share is incredible. Thank you.
Dustin, again, it's an honor. And at my age and at this stage of my career, I think the best thing I can do is help my fellow appraisers. And it's something that I thoroughly enjoy doing.
Well, as someone who is on the recipient end of that, thank you. It's truly valuable, and I appreciate it. Folks, thanks for joining us today. Another Appraiser Coach podcast, another enlightening discussion with Mr. Tim Andersen, and look forward to more of those in the future. Speaking of which, coming up in February, the 19th and the 26th, we do have Mr. Tim Andersen and Ernie Durbin, who will be on the program, not here, not at the podcast, but on my website. You can sign up for a webinar series talking about desktops and how to, if you should be involved, maybe giving you some information, maybe dispelling some of the myths in the first week. In the second week, Mr. Andersen will be on telling us how to complete an appraisal and be fully USPAP compliant. That doesn't matter if it's a 1004 or a desktop or some other type of alternative valuation. Hope you will join us. Jump on my website, theappraisercoach.com, for more information. Thanks for joining us today, folks, and we'll catch you next time.